All right, probably 30 more seconds. Still some stragglers coming in. UNC makes us have a waiting room, so I have to have dual attention here as we kick this off. Okay. So welcome to this panel, Talking Politics Over Turkey. I'm your moderator, Kurt Gray. I'm an associate professor at UNC and the director of the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding. I'm very pleased to welcome you and to introduce our speakers. Jay Van Bavel is an associate professor at NYU. He studies politics and morality in our social worlds and in the brain. Recently, Jay has been at the forefront of initiatives examining the power of Jay, not quite yet. There we go. Jay, steal my thunder. Jay's been at the forefront of initiatives examining the power of social science to affect positive behavior change in response to the COVID pandemic. Juliana Schroeder is an assistant professor at Berkley Haas School of Business who studies how people navigate their social worlds. She's the co-founder of the Psychology of Technology Institute, which studies, among other things, how technology can drive us apart and hopefully bring us together. John Sarrouf is the co-executive director and director of program development at Essential Partners, one of America's most respected conflict resolution organizations. He has helped bridge moral divides within some of the world's most intractable conflicts. And before we begin, I'd like to talk a little bit about the mission of the center and the background for this panel. So the center was formed a couple years ago in response to record levels of political polarization here in America. And I should say that if this is your first time on the internet in 2020, things aren't any better than they used to be. And so the center's primary goal is to bring together scientists from diverse disciplines and conduct innovative research about how to create moral understanding across these divides. Of course, there are many people and organizations seeking to bridge divides, but I think it's imperative that we do scientific research to really reveal what's most effective at bridging divides and what isn't. And I'll give you an example from our own research. So in a series of studies, we've shown that when you ask Americans what's the key thing they need to do in conversations to foster mutual respect, and they say, use facts and statistics, no matter whether the conversation is about immigration or guns or the election perhaps. It turns out, however, that this intuition is very wrong. When one person brings up a set of facts, the other person easily dismisses it as false, as fake news. And so it turns out that what fosters respect are narratives of personal experience, especially those involving vulnerability or potential harm. And so when someone trots out a statistic about COVID, it's easy to shrug off, but when someone discusses their personal experiences, let's say you're a nurse in North Dakota, for instance, it commands more respect. And so the center's mission is to uncover the roots of intolerance and develop novel theories and interventions to help overcome that intolerance. And so we achieve this mission through a number of programs. We have an innovative affiliates and scholars program, which build collaborative networks of researchers, each of whom are committed to using their research to improve the world. Another mission of the center is to connect science with society. So making sure that our science is informed by practitioners who are actually in the field, and making sure that practitioners' work is informed by the latest in research. And so this panel marks the beginning of our public events program, which I hope will provide insight and practical tips for how to make Thanksgiving and other times have more civil conversations. And we're starting with Thanksgiving because Thanksgiving is not only a time for gratitude, but also a time typically of heated political conversations. In fact, one study found that having a Thanksgiving dinner with people who differed in politics cuts the dinner half an hour short. And personally, I think this is insane, right? So polarization is clearly bad for our democracy, but you know it's bad when people will forego pumpkin or pecan or apple pie simply to stop talking to their relatives. Of course, many of us are staying put this Thanksgiving, but there's still lots of room for strained conversations, whether over the dinner table, in our quarantine bubbles, or over Zoom. So I'm really thrilled today to have Jay and Juliana and John, Triple J Threat, here to talk about the science and practice of bridging divides. Jay will talk about how our social identities shape our responses to COVID. Juliana will talk about the promise of conversation to bridging divides, and John will run through a hands-on exercise to make difficult dialogues easier. After each talk, we'll have a couple questions. You can chat them to me, and I can ask the speaker. And then after the talks, we'll have a little back and forth about how the speakers have taken their experiences and insights and changed how they have conversations, especially at Thanksgiving. So now I'll hand it over to Jay Van Bavel, who will talk about social identity and COVID. Thank you for coming, everyone. Oh, Jay, you're on mute. All right, I made Jay the host. Maybe that helps. Yeah, okay.
Okay, got it. Okay, thanks so much for having me, and thanks to everyone else for coming. I'm gonna set up my screen to share right now and jump right into a very brief talk on some research we've been doing on this exact topic. So as you know, all of us are living under a very unusual time, one of the most dangerous times, at least in my lifetime, in the last 100 years, as we face this global pandemic. And so what we've been trying to do, in my lab at least, is understand how aspects of polarization and partisanship in the US have impacted the way that we've dealt with this global crisis. And so, as Kurt mentioned, polarization has been growing for many years, many decades, in fact, in terms of what people's beliefs are. They seem to be pulling apart in terms of Democrats are becoming more and more liberal, Republicans more conservative over time. What the research suggests is even more damning is nicely summarized in a recent paper we have led by Eli Finkel and many other colleagues who are experts in polarization. We've noted that over and above this ideological divide, what seems to be more prominent and causing more conflict is an affective divide, where people now find that out-party hate is a stronger force than in-party love and might be one of the most powerful predictors of our voting intentions. So it's not just that you disagree with people, even when you might agree with them or have potential grounds for compromise, you don't want to because you find them aversive or immoral. And so this moralization of political conflict has come with these consequences about how we feel about others. The other thing that seems to be coming with it is a very foundational disagreement on what the facts of reality are. And as Kurt mentioned, this is a challenge because fact checks are not particularly effective, especially in domains of politics. A recent meta-analysis found that it's much less effective than fact checks in all kinds of other domains. And so basic disagreements on facts are incredibly important and dangerous at a moment where facts matter more than normal. So we can disagree about crowd sizes. And in that case, the facts don't really matter so much. But if you're really motivated based on your partisan affiliation or identity to disagree about the risk factors associated with a pandemic that is, in the US alone has killed over 250,000 people, and you're debating whether or not to wear a mask or to distance or go outside, these types of things that reduce risk, or whether or not to have a Thanksgiving dinner at all this year, are foundational issues that scientists have studied. And if we're disagreeing on those basic things, even when there's lots of data on those issues, that presents not only a challenge of agreement, but a life-threatening situation for us. And so this is something that has really marked the way that Americans in particular have dealt with the pandemic. And so I'm going to show you data from surveys from last February to March. And what you can see is that there's big variation within states. So Democrats in Washington and Republicans in Washington both agreed, this was Washington state when the pandemic hit there first, that they were concerned about the coronavirus. But even though they were more concerned, Democrats were more concerned than Democrats from other states, Republicans are more concerned than Republicans from other states. An even bigger divider was red versus blue. So it didn't matter what state you were from, whether or not there was a single case there yet, you were more concerned than people from every single other Republican state, even if they were facing an outbreak. And so a lot of us realized this might be a problem. This is going to be potentially devastating to people. But around the same time, researchers were using things like Google search and finding that although there's an initial divide in that Democrats are searching more for kind of like hand sanitizer and healthy things, in Republican districts over time, a few weeks, there was a shift where this partisan gap went away and suddenly Republicans seemed just as concerned about hand sanitizer. And so it suggested that maybe this partisan gap was something about how people talk to pollsters or the media, but wasn't reflected in actual behavior. And so, and this is something that happens if there's a distrust of pollsters or media, especially on the right. It's hard to know if they're being direct in some of their beliefs and attitudes. But at the time, I looked at all the data and I thought this is potentially a risky thing because if people don't take this seriously, it could lead to a large number of deaths. And so Anton Golitzer, who's a graduate student at Yale University, contacted me when he saw this article I wrote and said, well, we can test this. And he had data from 15 million smartphones moving around per day. And if you have a smartphone, your movement is being tracked. But these were anonymized, so we didn't look at any individuals. But we were able to look within counties and see how humans are moving. And this has really been foundational in this pandemic for tracking the transmission of the virus. As it moved to other countries and as it spread within countries, movement was foundational to understanding who was put at risk and what we could do to potentially mitigate risks or see where risks were emerging. And so we decided to do this with the smartphone data. And what you can see here is data starting from March 9th and going till right after Memorial Day. And what you can see is that relative to the previous year, on average across the United States, there was increased distancing such that after a few weeks, by the end of March, people were distancing about 25 to 50% more, depending on how you measured it, than they were the previous year. So people were following the public health guidelines, taking it seriously across the country. What you can also see is as the curve of the pandemic started to flatten in the US, and people maybe got fatigued by this, and the weather got nice, that kind of combination of things reduced social or spatial distancing, such that by Memorial Day, people were out. They were back to their old behaviors in terms of like traveling. When we looked inside the data, and we compared red states versus blue states or red counties versus blue counties, across over 3,000 counties, what we found is that there was a stubborn and consistent partisan gap, such that people from Democratic counties were engaging in more distancing than people from Republican counties. And we measured this by looking at how they voted in the last presidential election. So people from Trump voting states were less likely to follow the guidelines about distancing. And you can see little bumps here when you look at reduction of general movement. That's because on weekends, people were more likely to stay home and follow the distancing guidelines. But on average, still during the week, there was this gap. And something that was surprising to me, I thought this gap might close over time as the pandemic spread across the country and people came face to face with it. But if anything, the gap actually got bigger. And so by the end of it, you had an even bigger of the time we looked at it, the partisan gap was even bigger than when we began. And so even as people were becoming more familiar with the pandemic, these patterns of behavior continued to widen in terms of the partisan gap. And this wasn't just that these distancing effects happened, but it had consequences. So we looked a few weeks after each data point to see if it was leading to greater infections, and then even later than that, mortality. And this is exactly what we found. And not only did it lead to more mortality, but it seemed to be grounded in what media people were exposed to. So in counties where people were watching a lot more Fox News, this was associated with lower levels of physical distancing. So partisan media seems to play a role in people's behavior. It's filtering these messages to many millions of people. And then that seems to be predicting this lack of distancing in some counties led to increased COVID-19 infections in those same counties and greater mortality growth rates over time. And so this was done, in the spring. We just published this paper a couple weeks ago. And so this was really, really, to us, concerning findings. This wasn't just people's poll expressions on polls. It was manifest in the real behavior of millions of people that we could measure using these phone movement data. Some people have asked whether this is just conservatives or is it something about the party identification? One way to look at that is to go back to the last epidemic in the US. And what you find there when the Ebola epidemic was occurring was the exact opposite pattern, that Republicans, if anything, were more concerned about the pandemic than Democrats. And so what this suggests to us is it's not something about conservatives per se. It seems to be something about the specific party leadership and communication strategies in this pandemic. So it's something those things are often hard to tease apart, but this historical data gives us some clues. And then now you look 8 months later, and what you can see is that it's really the pandemic massively out of control, largely in red counties. And so you can see that just by looking at this map. It looks almost like an election map. And then here's the hardest hit states. So we found these same patterns in states. Here's what the worst hit states look like right now. As of today, I got this data about an hour ago. And so now you're seeing the massive consequences in the order of tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of deaths of these gaps. I should say that we measured a number of other variables, that, economy, population density, a lot of these other things early on, people thought might be accounting for why Democrats were taking it more seriously. Now we're seeing the spread in very rural areas, blue collar areas. And so, and our data bears that out. One of the most robust predictors was partisanship. And not only that, it was one of the strongest over and above all these other factors like spatial, how dense a place is, what the economics are, what the employment types are. And so this seems to be a really robust aspect of identity. And then you've seen this manifest in multiple super spreader events hosted by the White House. Here's one at the Supreme Court nomination. When leaders are role modeling and acting like this, it sends signals to members of those parties about what is appropriate risks to take. You've now seen 3 outbreaks in the White House. This was from the Supreme Court nomination. I actually think that the outbreak here probably happened behind the scenes when they had indoor events, because we now know that aerosol is a primary mechanism of transmission of COVID. So if you're gonna do a Thanksgiving event with your family, make sure it's outside. I would not do it inside. And so even if you're together, do it in a way that dramatically minimizes the risks to you. And I also want to say this didn't have to be the case. So I'm Canadian. The data in Canada was suggested that identity could have worked in an opposite way. So in Canada, there was a study analyzing social media messages from Liberals and Conservative party leaders. And in Canada, they all expressed equal concern about the pandemic. And then when they did surveys of Canadians, they found that they, across the political spectrum, were far more concerned. And so when you present a common purpose and a shared identity rallying against a threat, that's something that seems to get rid of these effects of polarization and partisanship, which are also occurring in Canada. And it might have been dramatically life-saving. So even though there is a slight outbreak in Canada right now, it looks nothing at all like the US. It's not rising as quickly. The deaths per capita and hospitalizations per capita are over 100% lower in Canada. So even though there is still an issue in these other countries, it looks nothing like the US. So these are important issues. And so I'm going to invite, I think, Julianne next to talk about how we can start to talk to people across this type of partisan divide. I might have to make Juliana the host. Okay, Juliana, you're now the host.
All right. Thank you so much, Jay. That was really interesting. Okay, so I am going to hop right in. Actually, hold on one second. There it is. Okay, Kurt, thank you so much for organizing this. I think it's completely timely, very fascinating. Jay, I can't wait to read all of those recent papers that came out just this year. I'm going to talk more about the kind of micro level dynamics of what's happening within conversation and how we can think about the way you can use conversation to bridge divides. So if you think about the function of conversation itself, there's been a lot of philosophical and psychology research that suggests that it's really about accessing and understanding the mind of another person in order to try to coordinate with him or her. And so that there's no, surprise there that one of the ways in which we think about resolving conflict, because it requires really understanding someone who might be completely different from us, is through conversation. And there's lots of organizations. John, you probably know these organizations better than I do. These are some of the ones we've been talking to that are trying to overcome conflict, bridging divides through having these conversations that are, respectful, meaningful interactions. But of course, we know that not all conversation is necessarily going to resolve conflict. Lots of conversations might enhance conflict. So all you need to do is go on social media, and then you see conversations that look something like this. I'm not going to go through this with you in a 10-minute talk, but Kyle and Bob, you can start to see this kind of fall apart. And so you can ask the question of, well, what went wrong in this conversation? What happened? And there are many things that went wrong, But one thing I will point you to is like the structure of the conversation itself. The fact that it happened on social media might be part of what went wrong here. And so one of the things that I've been looking at over the last several years is the way in which the medium of communication can change these conflict resolution outcomes. Of course, now we have all these different ways in which we can converse with another person. In fact, maybe in person is the least likely to happen now, but we have video chats, we have phone conversations, we can communicate via text. And so how are those changing the ways that conflict unfolds? And so we have this model we've been kind of playing with, and the idea is that the medium influences like two big things. So one, the way in which I express my opinion. So if I'm communicating with Kurt via text, I might express myself differently than if I'm talking to him or if I'm seeing him face to face. And then two, how Kurt would then consume what I'm saying. So if he's listening to it compared to reading it, even if the words are exactly the same, he might have very different takeaways. He might have different interpretations of what I meant. And I think there are all these different structural features, what we call the paralinguistic cues. That's like the extent to which you have intonation in your voice, the pacing of your voice, those things matter. The synchronicity by which people communicate. So that's like how quickly aligned in time that communication occurs. These are the types of things that we're looking at that influence these different conversation dynamics and will ultimately influence different conflict outcomes. So I'm an experimentalist, so we run a lot of experiments on people. Sometimes we do this in labs, sometimes we do it in the field. So I'll walk you through quickly like what an experiment that we've run looks like. Basically, we take a sample, like we go to Berkeley students, for example. I'm at Berkeley, and we pre-select some topics that are controversial among that particular sample. And so here are some topics that we selected for one of our initial experiments. Okay, so these are not necessarily, so these are things like whether or not there's an admissions race quota at UC Berkeley. All right, and then we bring participants into the laboratory. We have them complete a pre-survey telling us about their opinions about these different topics. And then we pair them based on strong disagreement while they do a filler task, which is a personality survey. They have a conversation where we randomly assign them to do it in different ways. And then they complete a post-survey telling us about their experiences. And so we do the randomization at the session level. So students are coming into a computer lab here. And we have them in this first experiment, we have 3 different conditions. So they video chat, they speak, or they write, and they do it all on the same platform just to keep that constant. So here they were doing it on the platform of Skype. All right, and so before the conversation, we're asking them about those topics. How much do you oppose and support the topics and how strongly you feel? And then as I mentioned, we're matching them based on strong agreement. So they have to be on opposite sides of the opposed support scale, and they have to all report that they feel strongly about it. And then during the conversation, we're recording all of those conversations. So we have all this really rich data on what's happening in those conversations, and they have 10 minutes to communicate. And then afterwards, we're asking them questions like this, like what were your impressions of your partner? How much did you understand your partner's opinions? How much conflict was in the conversation? And then attitude change, to what extent do you agree with your partner? And then what we see in this particular experiment, results that look like this. So first, between video chatting versus just speaking, we don't see on average differences in the impressions that people form of their partner there. There's no difference between those bars. But when these pairs are randomly assigned to write to each other, they have lower impressions of each other. After that interaction, they report they understand each other less. They report that they have more conflict. And then they report less change in their attitude. So in this metric, anything above 0 is that they are moving towards their partner. So even the writing condition participants are moving a little bit towards their partner, but less so than when they video chat or speak. And in fact, by the end, if you ask them overall, do you think you disagreed or agreed more? People report that they're still just disagreeing in the writing conversation, whereas in the video chatting and speaking, they're more on the side of agreement. So we've actually run 10 experiments here. I'm going to go through each of them. Kurt, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to go through each of these experiments. He would kill me. Instead, I'm just going to give you the really high level findings of what's kind of come out of this body of work so far. So one finding is that it does seem like this effect of the medium on these conversational outcomes is pretty robust to the topic of conversation. We've tested lots of different topics. The ideology of the participants, we're working with an organization called Bridge, where we've actually been running these kind of field experiments at universities across the country. So we've hit a bunch of these universities so far, and we see the effect at all of them. Two is that it seems like the changes occur quite early. So here's something where we were actually tracking at different parts in the conversation, what was the self-reported level of understanding of each of the interactants. And you can see that, as soon as you get into the very first part of the conversation, it happens within the first few minutes. There's already a change in the level of understanding the spoken conversation participants are reporting compared to the written conversation participants. The paralinguistic cues seem to matter. So why is this happening? So one thing that we think is important is the fact that the person's voice has intonation and changes in the pacing that people perceive as being associated with their mental capacities. And so what I mean by that is that if you just read the words that I am, read the words of what I'm expressing, you're not necessarily going to kind of put in the intonation that I myself as the communicator would have expressed were I to say those words. And so you consume them quite differently. And so we use a program called PRAT to kind of measure these paralinguistic cues. And we find that the variance in the cues in particular are the things that seem to be conveying the person's thoughts and feelings the most. And then finally, fourth thing here is that synchrony matters. So the fact that speaking is extremely synchronous, I think is quite important compared to writing. And in fact, we can turn off the effect. So synchronous conversation, that's just the way people would normally speak to each other or write to one another across a program like Skype. But in an asynchronous condition in experiments we've run where we have people like send voicemail messages to each other. So we're still technically talking to one another, but it's completely detached in time. So I would send Kurt a voicemail, you get it, listen to it, and then send one back to me. Then actually we can pretty much get rid of the effect there. So there, the speaking is just as no different from the writing outcomes. This is on the metric of positive impressions. Okay, and then this is the final thing for real, is that it seems, one thing that's very interesting is that it seems like if you ask people to predict that they do not expect these results. And in fact, if you ask like which condition would they prefer to be in, if we give them the choice, they overwhelmingly choose that they would prefer to write to each other, and they also would prefer to do it asynchronously. And the reason I say wrong in quotes here is because this is like wrong if you are trying to resolve conflict. Like if you care about understanding the other party or having a positive impression of them, then that I think being in the writing condition is going to lead to the worst outcomes according to all these experiments we run. But people might have other motives here, right? So they might just want to seem right, or they might want to avoid the other person as much as possible. And so, in their mind, maybe they actually want to be in the writing condition. So we're investigating that more. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up, I think there's been a lot of really fantastic work that started to look at what are the semantic changes that should occur in a conversation, being respectful, maybe political correctness, things like the extent to which questions are being asked that I think are important to understand the dynamics of the conversation. But there's a whole new line of work that could be done that focuses on not just what's happening in the conversation, but the way in which the conversation occurs. So the structural features of the conversation. Is it happening by voice, or is it happening via writing? Is there audience presence or absence? What's the technology by which it's occurring? And so I think those things matter too. And one of the key kind of insights of this work is that they could matter a lot in terms of the conflict resolution outcomes. Okay, so that is all I have. I'm going to stop my share. Thank you guys. Excellent. And then I will make John the host next. There you go.
And now I have to admit people from the waiting room, which is an interesting thing that I didn't realize. Kurt, are we doing questions now, or are we going to go on to the exercise? I can't hear you, so I'm going to make you the host. How do I do the make host?
All right, thanks, Jay and John. This is my first time hosting a big Zoom event, and I was afraid of the mysterious Zoom bombers, which you've heard of. So I've squeezed the security concerns, but I think we're all friends now. We've all shared experiences, and I think I can change some things. So I'll open up the chat because I'm assuming that John will want people to chat about their experiences. And lots of all of a sudden questions that I'm seeing now. I think maybe we can, John, how long is your exercise going to take? Can you, there we go. John, 10 minutes? All right, you can unmute yourself. All right, so we can actually take a couple questions now. I think for Juliana and for Jay. I have one question for Juliana and then one for Jay. All right, so Juliana, Nivo asks, couldn't the preference for writing is due to the fact that people feel implicit duress to agree with the other person in a more personalized environment, but without attaining a real agreement? So how deep, I guess, is this agreement?
Yeah, we actually wondered if that was part of what was happening in the spoken conversations compared to the written conversations, that basically spoken conversations, they're, talking about something else, so they're faking agreement with one another. And so that's why we see these like higher levels of agreement afterwards. That doesn't seem to be the case because we have all the conversations, so we can code for stuff like that. So they actually do get into disagreement. And in fact, if you ask the participants afterwards to report their understanding of their counterparts' attitudes, so just rate the person's attitudes on a couple different topics, they're more accurate in the spoken conversation than in the written conversation condition, which suggests that they actually are understanding each other more and they're getting into the conflict. So I don't think that's what's driving the difference. And I don't think it's that the spoken conversation participants are just, not discussing their disagreement. However, I totally agree with that question that that could be part of the reason people want to avoid the spoken conversation condition. I think it could be multiple reasons as to why people want to do that. I think what we're kind of seeing in the data so far is that it's just this preference to keep distant from the other person. I think it's amazing that we have participants, we bring them into the lab, so they're all sitting at computers in the same space. This was before COVID, of course. And we asked, like, there's someone like, 2 rows down from you, would you like to talk to them or do you want to type with them? And they're like, oh, I want to type with them. But yeah, I think there could be lots of things underlying those preferences and there's more to be done there. Great question.
Great. Thanks, Juliana. And I know you have some amazing work showing that people actually underestimate how good they'll feel after small talk. So if we have time, maybe we can talk about that. One question for Jay from Hyman. The question is, in your analyses, do you control for kind of other incidents in each county? The question is whether kind of experiencing and witnessing actual COVID impacts affects people's behavioral outcomes. So do you think North Dakota, for instance, might change now that you're actually seeing these effects?
Yeah, so that would be the prediction. That's what I wrote in the Washington Post piece in March, that there'd be like what I call reality constraints. So normally partisanship and identities bias judgments insofar as the information you're looking at is ambiguous, and then reality constrains that. But all the points of evidence suggest that that's not happening. In fact, there was a nurse from North Dakota who was, it went viral. She was on CNN this week, who really blew my mind. She was saying, like, she's in the hospital. She's about to put people under intubation, that they can barely breathe. And they're insisting to her that they don't have COVID, that it must be lung cancer or something. And they should be like FaceTiming their families because they might never talk to them again. They're about to potentially die. And she's seeing this over and over again. And there's a lot of reports coming from nurses in some hard-hit places. El Paso, I read about another doctor saying the same thing. And so there's this, again, this surprises me because I didn't think partisan effects were this big on people's judgments of reality, but they, at least in some populations now, seem to be this big. And this is not just an abstraction. I have family members from a very politically diverse family, and they're telling me the same things. They're telling me this is the flu. It's not reality. Even though I study these things, they know that they're talking to me, and they will insist upon it. And so all kinds of evidence is hitting a lot of people. Maybe as policies change in those states, or maybe if Trump leaves the public stage, it will change. But I think it's seriously infected people's perceptions of reality in a way that is remarkably resistant to experience and reality and information.
Great answer, even if it's a little disheartening, the power of social identity over reality. But maybe there's ways for conversations to bridge it, especially once we're equipped with the tools that John will be giving us right now. So I'm going to hand it off to John. I think you can share right now.
Great, thanks. And I'm going to just do this without sharing. We're going to talk you through a bit of an experiment. I just want to say thank you to Juliana and to Jay and to Kurt. The data and the research you're doing is so helpful to people who are out in the field trying to do this, because we're often challenged about some of the things that we do about, well, why don't you just let us talk about our facts? Why don't you, all the different kinds of pushback we get, and having the research you have provided is really, really important. So thank you for it. I'm going to do a little exercise here. And this is to help you recognize what goes on for you during one of these difficult Thanksgiving conversations. What's happening to you in the midst of a difficult interaction between family and friends, how it impacts your reactions, and then how, with some reflection and purposeful thinking about it, you can find an alternative that might be available to you upon reflection. And so how do you prepare yourself for a different way of being around the table, around a difficult conversation? So I want you now to think of a time, maybe a recent holiday or family gathering, when you became upset because someone you loved and care about, so it's important that it's not just a random person, but somebody you really care about, you want to have a relationship with, said something disparaging or upsetting about something that's important to you. Okay, it might be your core social or political value or belief. It might be about someone else you love. It might be some part of your identity. So don't choose something that's going to make you so upset again now that it's going to be hard for you to hang in there, but something that feels alive and real to you. So just think about that. Just try to really focus, not generically, but really on a moment where you've had that experience. So I'll give you a couple seconds just to pinpoint that moment. All right, hopefully people have something to go on. If you put yourself back into that moment, I want you in the chat, just feel free to pop it in there. What was physically going on in your body? What was manifesting physically, physiologically? What was happening in your body? Throw it up in the chat. Stress, heart racing, tension. Yep, hot face, sweaty. Yep, general symptomatic nervous system increase. This seems to be a group of scientists here, Kurt, that you've assembled. Yeah, adrenaline, discomfort, nail picking, nice, dizzy, sweating, great. It's good, good. I'm getting all flustered already. It's real, right? It's something's physically happening to you. And you all know this because you're scientists. An identity threat like this reacts in our bodies just like a physical threat, right? Okay, now feelings. Just talk about the feelings and the emotions that come up. What emotional life, what's the emotional life that comes up? Contempt. Yep, desire to leave the room. Anger, hopelessness. Yeah, anger, anxiety, frustration, disappointment, distress, betrayal, anger. Yep, good. Shock. Sadness is a big one. Disappointment. Good. Yeah, again, all of these things come rushing in at this moment. What thoughts are going through your mind? Thoughts about yourself and about the other person. Write down whatever thought, what's the tape that's going through your mind? What's your self-talk about this? Right? How come this person thinks this way? WTF? Yep. Idiots. Yep. Good. Lots of expletives going on here. Excellent. Great. I'll never see my perspective, right? All this despair talk. Yep. Doomed. Yeah. Great. Okay. Great. So now in this moment, what's your temptation? What's your impulse? What's the thing that you feel? And you don't have to admit whether you did it or not, but what were you tempted to do in that moment? Whether you did it or not, what were you tempted to do? What was your impulse? Attack. walk out, leave, argue, yell, run, give up, blame their intelligence, yes, disengage, discredit, right? Throw a lot of facts at them, right? With back to that. Good. Yeah, interrupt. Good. Which gets to a lot of some of the structures that Juliana was talking about too, right? A lot of the negative structures that actually get us caught in conversations like this. Shake them. Excellent. Okay. Okay, breathe, shake that off. We can shake ourselves. Just get rid of that for a second. Now, I want you to reflect for a moment, and I want you to think, this is what I want you to hold in your mind. This is a person you care about and love. Okay? And I want you to think about what you might have done in that moment that could have left you feeling like you'd fully respected yourself, and that would have left the other person that you were talking with feeling fully respected as well. Like you'd really brought your full best self to this conversation. What could you have done that would have left you feeling like, gosh, that's the best of me. That's exactly who I want to be. And I feel respected, and I think they feel respected too. Acknowledge some good reasons for what they believe. Lead with a hear you, ask questions, show empathy, total honesty about how I'm feeling. So report really honestly about what's going on for me. Understanding the cultural context, good. Fully humanizing them. Back channeling, yep. Ask more questions that give them the benefit of the doubt, nice. Acknowledge that we're both trying to do our best here. Nice. Discuss logically instead of reactive. Yep. Breathe and pause. Great. So nice. So the moral of the story is that you all have within you already the wisdom to have a better conversation. If you code all these, actually, I may just share my screen for 1 second to share with you what we call the constructive cycle of conversation, which probably maps onto some work that our researchers have done here. But let me just share it with you if I have that capacity. So all the things that you probably just wrote map on pretty well to what we call the constructive cycle of communication, which is that you can, at any point in the midst of a difficult conversation, change the way you listen, change the way you reflect, change the way you speak or respond, or change the kinds of questions that you ask that will interrupt a vicious cycle of escalation and a really difficult conversation. And this gets to the first thing that Kurt talked about, which is asking about stories, right? I want to ask about stories. I want to ask about values. I want to ask for clarification, right? I want to ask an open and honest question, not a trapping question, not a question that's going to sort of is a judgment with a question mark at the end. Right? I want to listen differently. I want to listen to what somebody really cares about, listen for what their values are, what they mean, assume good intentions, right? Somebody said that in the list, right? Give them the benefit of the doubt. So you listen differently. If I'm listening vigilantly, I'm going to find all of the things that are wrong with what somebody's talking about. If I listen with a different mode, if I listen to what they're really trying to say, what they care about, I will find that too. Reflect, slow down, pause, right? So the evidence is that we get triggered, all of these things, all the chemicals go rushing in. It's a split second, a fifth of a second is all it takes for that to get triggered in us. It takes about 20 minutes for all of these chemicals to calm down. So counting to 10 is a good start. Taking a walk and and relaxing a little bit, it might be better. Deciding that there's a better time at some point, getting perspective, right? Perspective, empathy, what you were all saying in the chat. Respond, speak to be understood rather than to convince. share your hopes and concerns, share from your own stories, right? Exactly what Kurt was talking about before. Let me share a story about why this is so important to me. Okay, so this, at any point, you as an individual without a facilitator there can help shift the conversation from a stuck cycle to a more constructive one. So before we leave this exercise, I want you right now to prepare yourself for next week. Okay, Thanksgiving is coming in a week. We all have that relative or that friend who is apt to say that thing that is going to provoke us, that is going to trigger it, and they may be ready. They may be preparing right now to say that thing to us. Right? It may just be that kind of person. What can you do right now, even in preparing for that moment, knowing that you love them, knowing that you don't want you don't want to skip apple pie and pecan pie because you're going to end 30 minutes early. What can you do to prepare yourself? What's the question that you might want to ask? What's the way you want to reflect? What is it that you want to bring with you to that interaction to help that potentially be more meaningful, open, deep, connecting conversation? And that's one of the things we talk about in our work, is that our differences should be our strengths. Our differences should enlighten and empower us, make us stronger as a community, as a family. And instead, what happens is they divide and make us feel like we don't belong, that we actually don't belong. And our difference is, if we're going to invite diversity into our communities, we're going to value that as a pluralism, as a country, as a community, we need to find a way to live into the fullness of that diversity. How can we do that? Part of it is preparing ourselves to have a better conversation. So what can you do? All right, I'll make you the host.
Thanks,
Kurt.
Thanks, John. I've got host powers.
Oh, you got the host. Good. Okay.
That's extremely helpful. Thank you very much. Before we move on to what each of our speakers is doing for Thanksgiving, John, there was one question for you about whether this kind of changed response is somehow inauthentic, right? That people will doubt what you're saying because it's not the real you. If you're, taking this time and pausing, if it's not real in the same way that conflict is real.
It's a great question. I think that it. I would imagine that it is part of the real me. It's the me that I want to be. It's the relationship that I want to have. I think part of this exercise is to indicate to us that when we feel triggered, our choices are limited. And when we reflect and slow down and make a different choice, we're actually having more agency to choose who we want to be. And so I think if you do it as a like, okay, I'm going to do this thing to you that I learned in this thing. Yeah, people will feel manipulated and upset by it and all that. My wife does that. Don't do that thing to me where what I'm hearing is, right? But if it's honest, so I want to be able to understand you because I want to be able to have a good conversation about this. Could you help me understand? And it is honest. If it comes from a place of honesty, it will be received that way. Unless you write it on a computer next to the person, and then it won't be, according to Juliana's research.
That is a great answer, and it's heartening to know that even as we struggle with these techniques, that you as well can't avoid struggling a little bit too. And so we have a little bit of time left, and what I'd like to do is ask each of our panelists kind of how they approach their Thanksgiving conversations differently, knowing what they know about their science and their practice. So we'll start with Jay, maybe a brief insight about what you do. Or don't
Yeah,
you?
so
Jay's Canadian, so this isn't even his Thanksgiving.
So my Thanksgiving was a month ago, and I missed that because of the pandemic. So I'll say for these conversations, one thing I try to do is I realize that if people in my family are sharing misinformation, and I try to find out what the source is that they're reading. And what I've learned, for example, for some family members, is I'm never going to convince them to read, the New York Times. They just find it too biased, or they don't like the opinion of it. So I've been trying to encourage them to read higher quality news that has a conservative perspective. So like the Wall Street Journal, or in Canada, the National Post. So that's for at least one of my family members. And I found that's actually more effective. Another thing I'll do going forward that I picked up from Juliana is that a lot of these, since I'm far from home and it's a pandemic, a lot of these conversations are happening over Facebook messaging and chat and stuff and email. And so I'm going to try to move it off of that and move it into a phone conversation or something like that. I didn't realize that. I always knew that these were a challenge through these mediums. I know that social media is one of the worst places on earth to have a political conversation because it's very performative. It feels like you're shouting because it gets blasted out to 500 people, or you quote tweet somebody and it feels like you're dunking on them. That's what the reward structure is. So I always knew that that was a very toxic way to disagree with people. But now even just like texting privately with somebody, I realize might not be the most effective. So I'm going to also update my communication strategies based on the research that I just heard today.
Great, thanks, Jay. Juliana?
Jay stole mine. No, I'm kidding. I love email, actually. So I guess the one thing that, at some point you're in an email rabbit hole and you're like, when should I jump out and like move onto the phone? And I think I move onto the phone faster. I'm like, okay, after the 30 email, like we're immediately moving into the phone here. So that I find, I think like maybe something broader, and it kind of fits with like the broader research program, is like thinking about all these incidental cues that are probably influencing the conversation. So like, is it a group conversation or a one-on-one conversation? Like, is there a lot of like background noise that's distracting? Like, so just thinking about like how the conversation actually happens, like maybe you shouldn't have that conversation when you know that there's gonna be like 4 conservatives and you're a liberal, like that's gonna really change the dynamic in a way that you should think about before you start it, as opposed to maybe you wanna have the one-on-one conversation and you wanna do it, spoken. And so I think like I'm thinking more about some of those different incidental cues and how I can like use that to make the conversation happen in the, like set it up structurally so it has the best possible chance of success, and then applying all of like John's great insights kind of into that.
Great, interesting, right? Yeah, pick the context. And so John, we'd love to hear from you as well. I know there was one question from Scott that maybe ties in about whether the goal of your techniques is about maintaining, repairing relationship, or changing minds. I know in social psychology, we talk about persuasion, and that's a big topic of study, but also just about understanding, which is, what I think sometimes we're talking about and what the center's trying to do as well. So maybe you could talk about that as you go.
Yeah, it's more about understanding than changing minds. I think people might change their minds if there's enough trust built up between the person, if they don't feel disparaged by you. And you might, and one of the other questions is, what if their facts are wrong? I mean, as you all said, you're not going to convince them with more facts, but you might convince them by talking as in a way that Jay was talking about. Well, here's some of the research that I've been reading, and it's been convincing me because of, and these are the reasons I trust that research, and this is what I've been listening to, and it's meant a lot to me, and it feels like it's been helpful to me, but it may not be to you. I mean, really giving people agency to be able to say what they trust and what they believe in, but to report very honestly about why you trust the things you trust, why you believe them. For me, my own personal technique is to stay curious, to just ask lots of good questions, to ask stories, to ask why people believe what they believe, what's important about it for them, what's at stake for them. It's more understandable why somebody would choose to keep an economy open when what they're talking about is their family business might be collapsing. I might still totally disagree with the approach, but it's just more understandable, and I can relate to that in a different way. So I try to ask a lot of questions and stay open to understanding them in a different way. And curiosity is pretty contagious. They tend to ask a lot of questions back. The other thing that if you're going to do this, to Juliana was talking to what Juliana was talking about, if you're going to do this in a larger group, we do this in dialogue and it may feel a little forced, but I do a go around. Like I really want to invite all the voices, because sometimes what can happen is 2 people just go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and it escalates. Everybody else gets really tense. Nobody wants to be part of it. It actually needs to be broken up from that pattern And one way to break it up is to just ask for a story from everyone around the circle, and it slows things down and it changes the pace. So.
Excellent. Thanks. Thanks, Jay and Juliana and John. I'm mindful of our time here. So it seems that folks suggest educating, thinking about context, remaining curious. And I mean, that's really what science is all about as well. And I think what we hope to do in our work at the center as well. So this talk is being recorded. If you couldn't make it, then, well, you are making it because you're here, but when we send it out, it'll be on the center page at moralunderstanding.com. And so you can share it widely with folks if that's interesting to you. This is also the beginning of our event series, and we're gonna have more things like this in the new year once we start ramping up. So I hope you can join us for that. And I hope for your own Thanksgiving, this has helped you have more civil conversations and more civil dialogue, and that you eventually next week get to finish your pie. So thanks again. Thanks to our speakers, and we'll see you soon.